From a woman waking up next to the love of her life, only to find him already gone, to a hero who coded in his own hospital without anyone realizing who he was. These deaths turned viewers into wrecks and doctors into ghosts of themselves. This is every major death in Grey's Anatomy, and yes, it's as brutal as you remember. Starting off with none other than Denny Duket. Denny Duket's death represented Grey's Anatomy's first truly devastating loss of a beloved reoccurring character, setting the template for the heartbreak that would define the series for years to come. Jeffrey Dean Morgan's portrayal of the charming heart patient created one of television's most tragic love stories, proving that sometimes love isn't enough to overcome impossible circumstances. Denny arrived at Seattle Grace Hospital as a long-term patient of Preston Burke, diagnosed with viral cardiomyopathy that had caused complete heart failure. His condition was so severe that he required constant hospitalization while waiting for a heart transplant. During his extended stay, Denny's natural charm and humor made him irresistible to the young intern assigned to his care, Izzy Stevens. The relationship between Denny and Izzy developed slowly but intensely throughout season 2. What began as innocent flirtation evolved into something much deeper as Izzy found herself spending every free moment in his room playing Scrabble and knitting him sweaters. Their connection transcended the typical patient-doctor dynamic, with Denny falling genuinely in love with Izzy while she struggled to maintain professional boundaries. The crisis that would ultimately seal Denny's fate began when a heart became available at Mercy West Medical Center, initially prepped for surgery and filled with hope. Denny's world collapsed when the donor flatlined, making the heart unsuitable for transplant. Desperate to help the man she loved, Izzy made a catastrophic decision that would haunt her forever. When another heart became available, but Denny wasn't sick enough to qualify, Izzy convinced him to let her cut his LVAD wire, artificially worsening his condition to move him up the transplant list. After Izzy severed the wire that kept his artificial heart pumping, Denny's condition deteriorated rapidly, requiring manual heart massages to keep him alive. The medical chaos that followed involved the entire intern class, with George taking over manual compressions while Christina examined his heart. When Denny briefly regained consciousness during this nightmare, he used what he thought might be his final moments to propose to Izzy, declaring his love even as his life hung in the balance. Dr. Erica Hahn successfully performed the heart transplant surgery, and for a few precious hours, it seemed like the impossible gamble had paid off. Denny marveled at having warm hands and a regular heartbeat for the first time in months, joking with Izzy about their future together and confirming his desire to marry her. Everyone believed that they had witnessed a miracle, that love had literally conquered death through Izzy's desperate intervention. But Grey's Anatomy had already established its cruel signature would all come to dread. Hope followed by devastation. Later that night, while Izzy was away, Denny threw a clot from his surgical incision site. The clot traveled to his brain, causing a massive stroke that killed him at 7:42 p.m. on May 14, 2006. He was 36 years old, with a brand new heart that would never get the chance to beat for the woman he loved. The aftermath of Denny's death created ripple effects that lasted for seasons. Izzy's guilt over her role in his death, combined with the $8.7 million inheritance he had left her, fundamentally changed her character. His death also established the show's pattern of killing beloved characters just when happiness seemed within reach. I think Denny's death was particularly brutal because it came so close to a happy ending, proving that even love and medical miracles can't always overcome fate. If Denny's death hit you harder than you cared to admit, hit that like button. You're definitely not alone. This was just the beginning of the show's emotional massacre. That was just the first crack in Meredith's world. Next, they made her an orphan. The deaths of Meredith Grey's parents represented two of the most emotionally devastating and formative losses in Grey's Anatomy history, fundamentally reshaping the show's protagonist and forcing her to confront a lifetime of complicated family dynamics. Ellis Grey and Thatcher Grey's deaths, occurring 12 seasons apart, bookended Meredith's journey from a damaged young woman seeking approval to a mature surgeon who had learned to forgive and find peace with her painful past. Ellis Grey's deterioration and eventual death in Season 3 established how Grey's Anatomy would handle deeply personal losses intertwined with complex family relationships. Kate Burton's portrayal of the brilliant but emotionally distant surgeon created a character who was simultaneously inspiring and heartbreaking, whose Alzheimer's diagnosis had reduced her from a two-time Harper Avery Award winner to a confused patient living in the fragments of memories from her surgical residency. The circumstances leading to Ellis's final hospitalization began with one of her rare moments of complete lucidity, a cruel gift that allowed her to remember everything except the previous 5 years and her devastating diagnosis. When Meredith had to explain that she had Alzheimer's and was living in a care facility, Ellis's emotional collapse led to cardiac arrhythmias that required immediate medical intervention. Despite Ellis's attempts to refuse treatment, Meredith authorized the necessary surgery, unwilling to let her mother die from a treatable condition. The procedure was successful, and Ellis's brief return to awareness allowed for precious final conversations with both Meredith and Richard Weber, the love of her life, who had chosen his wife over their affair 30 years earlier. However, Ellis's lucidity proved temporary, and the stress of surgery, combined with emotional trauma, overwhelmed her weakened system. Ellis coded and could not be resuscitated, dying at age 54 with her brilliant mind finally at peace. 12 seasons later, Thatcher Gray's death would prove equally devastating, but in entirely different ways, representing the loss of possibilities rather than the end of ongoing conflict. Following Lexi's tragic death in the plane crash, Thatcher had maintained his sobriety, but had lost touch with Meredith, traveling to Zimbabwe and finding purpose in international humanitarian work. When Richard Weber learned that Thatcher had been diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia and was in hospice care with only weeks to live, Meredith initially avoided visiting him. The revelation that Thatcher might not even have days left finally motivated her to make the journey to his bedside. Their final conversation was initially awkward, weighted by decades of missed opportunities, but gradually evolved into something approaching peace. As Thatcher's breathing became labored, their conversation turned to family. Meredith told him about Maggie Pierce and shared stories about her children that allowed Thatcher to understand the family legacy he was leaving behind. After Meredith finished telling him about his grandchildren, Thatcher simply took his final breath and died peacefully. The contrasting nature of these deaths highlighted Meredith's growth over the course of the series. Ellis's death had left her with complicated grief, while Thatcher's death brought closure and genuine forgiveness, forcing Meredith to confront that parents are flawed human beings rather than idealized figures. I think the way Grey's Anatomy handled both parental deaths showed remarkable emotional maturity, demonstrating that healing is possible, even when it comes very late. But parental grief was nothing compared to what came next when they took one of her best friends. T.R. Knight's portrayal of the compassionate, insecure intern had made George the heart of the original group, and his tragic death would prove that no one was safe from the show's increasingly merciless storytelling. George had spent 5 seasons struggling to find his place in the competitive world of surgery, constantly overshadowed by his more confident peers, and earning the humiliating nickname 007 after freezing during his first procedure. Despite his insecurities, George possessed genuine surgical talent and unwavering compassion for his patients, qualities that eventually caught the attention of trauma surgeon Owen Hunt. Under Owen's mentorship, George finally discovered his calling in trauma surgery, finding confidence in high-pressure situations where his calm demeanor and quick thinking could save lives. The decision that would ultimately lead to George's death came from his desire to gain real-world trauma experience by serving as a medical officer in Iraq. After connecting with a patient who, like himself, felt like an outsider in his own family, George made the life-changing decision to join the U.S. Army. His friends were devastated by the news, planning an intervention to convince him to stay. Understanding their concerns, but determined to follow his path, George met with Chief Weber to finalize his decision, receiving the day off to spend time with his family before deploying. The tragic irony of George's death lay in its random, heroic nature, exactly the kind of selfless act that defined his character throughout the series. We all knew it would happen, but we weren't ready for it. On June 10th, 2009, while traveling to see his family one last time before leaving for Iraq, George encountered Amanda, a young woman waiting at a bus stop. When a city bus bore down on her as she stepped into the street, George threw himself in front of the bus without hesitation, pushing Amanda to safety while taking the full impact of the collision himself. The aftermath created one of Grey's Anatomy's most heartbreaking mysteries. George was brought to Seattle Grace Hospital as an unidentified John Doe patient, his face so severely damaged from the impact that even his closest friends couldn't recognize him. His injuries were catastrophic. Severe trauma to his left arm, head, face, pelvis, and abdomen, requiring immediate surgical intervention and leaving him intubated and unable to speak. The cruel twist that made George's situation even more tragic was that his friends were actively searching for him, completely unaware that he was lying unconscious just floors away. Meredith Grey was assigned as the resident overseeing John Doe's care, not knowing she was caring for one of her dearest friends. George's desperate attempts to communicate his identity initially went unnoticed, his hand movements dismissed as random gestures from a brain-injured patient. The moment of recognition became one of television's most emotionally devastating scenes. During his second attempt to communicate with Meredith, George managed to trace the numbers 007 on her palm, the nickname he hated, but that now served as his only hope for identification. Initially confused, Meredith suddenly understood what she was seeing. The confirmation came through Callie Torres, who remembered his distinctive Texas-shaped birthmark. By then, George's condition had deteriorated beyond salvation. Despite the team's best efforts, George's brain began to swell uncontrollably. He was ultimately declared brain dead, his heroic heart finally stopping after fighting valiantly to survive. I think George's death was particularly brutal because it came just as he had found his purpose and confidence, proving that Grey's Anatomy would kill characters at their happiest moments. The 007 recognition scene remains one of the most devastating moments in television history. And just when we thought it couldn't get worse, they shot up the hospital. Charles Percy's death during the Seattle Grace Hospital shooting represented one of Grey's Anatomy's most heartbreaking losses, demonstrating how violence could destroy innocent lives and promising futures in an instant. Robert Baker's portrayal of Mercy West resident had made Charles a sympathetic character whose genuine kindness and unrequited love for Reed Anderson endeared him to viewers, making his tragic end all the more devastating. Charles had arrived at Seattle Grace as part of the controversial Mercy West merger, initially struggling to fit in with the established group of residents who viewed the newcomers with suspicion and hostility. Despite his large physical presence, Charles had a gentle nature that often made him the target of jokes and dismissive comments from his new colleagues. What made Charles truly compelling was his unrequited love for fellow Mercy West resident Reed Adamson, a crush he had harbored since medical school but never found the courage to confess. Reed viewed him as a little brother figure, completely unaware of his romantic feelings. On the day that would become his last, Charles was working on the case of Mary Portman, a patient requiring a colostomy reversal who had been waiting for her surgery. When Gary Clark, a grieving widower seeking revenge against the doctors he blamed for his wife's death, entered the hospital with a gun, Charles found himself in the wrong place at the worst possible time. The hospital lockdown trapped him with Bailey and Mary in her room, creating a terrifying situation where their only hope was to remain hidden and silent until the threat passed. The circumstances of Charles' shooting were particularly cruel in their randomness. After Bailey spotted Gary Clark in the hallway and instructed everyone to hide, Charles concealed himself in the bathroom while Mary played dead under her bed sheets. When Clark entered the room, he initially seemed satisfied that the patient appeared to have died and began to leave. But a small sound from the bathroom caught his attention. The moment Clark opened that door and found Charles hiding there, the young resident's fate was sealed. Clark's question, "Are you a surgeon?" became a death sentence that Charles couldn't avoid answering honestly. When Charles confirmed that he was indeed a surgeon, Clark shot him in the abdomen without hesitation, viewing him as part of the medical establishment responsible for his wife's death. Clark spared Bailey only because she claimed to be a nurse rather than a doctor. The aftermath of Charles' shooting created one of the series' most emotionally devastating sequences. With Clark gone, Bailey and Mary worked desperately to save Charles's life using whatever limited supplies they could find in the patient room. Despite Bailey's medical expertise and Mary's willing assistance, Charles's injuries were too severe for the makeshift treatment they could provide. Their attempt to drag him to an operating room became futile when they discovered the elevators had been shut down during the lockdown. Realizing that Charles was dying and there was nothing more they could do, Bailey made the difficult decision to tell him the truth about his condition. In his final moments, Charles displayed the same selfless concern for others that had characterized his entire time at the hospital. His dying wish was for Bailey to find Reed and tell her that he loved her, not knowing that Reed had already been killed by the same gunman who had shot him. Charles's death was particularly devastating because he represented the kind of person who makes the world better through small acts of kindness and dedication. But his death was just part of a larger tragedy that would claim more innocent lives, proving that when violence enters a place of healing, no one is truly safe. Still hanging on? Consider subscribing. We got plenty more heartbreak queued up, and you're gonna want emotional support by the end of this, especially with Henry Henry's death proved that sometimes the cruelest deaths come not from violence or accidents, but from the very medical conditions that bring people into hospitals seeking hope. Scott Foley's portrayal of the charming, optimistic patient who married Teddy Altman for insurance coverage created a love story that was both unconventional and deeply moving, making his eventual death all the more heartbreaking for viewers who would watch their relationship evolve from practical arrangement to genuine love. Henry first arrived at Seattle Grace Hospital as a patient with von Hippel-Lindau syndrome, a rare genetic disorder that caused multiple tumors throughout his body and required constant medical monitoring and treatment. Without insurance and facing mounting medical bills that had already bankrupted him multiple times, Henry was in the impossible position of needing life-saving care he couldn't afford. His condition was complex and ongoing, requiring regular surgeries and treatments that would continue for the rest of his life. The unconventional solution to Henry's insurance problem came from Teddy Altman, who witnessed his deteriorating condition and made the extraordinary decision to marry him so he could access her health benefits. Their marriage was initially purely transactional, a legal arrangement designed to save Henry's life rather than a romantic union. However, this practical beginning would eventually evolve into something much deeper as they spent time together and discovered genuine compatibility beneath their unusual circumstances. Rather than becoming bitter or self-pitying about his condition, Henry maintained his sense of humor and zest for life, even as his body betrayed him repeatedly. His background as a former professional baseball player added another layer of tragedy to his story, showing how dramatically his life had changed from athletic peak performance to chronic illness. The relationship between Henry and Teddy developed slowly and naturally, moving from awkward roommates to genuine friends to reluctant lovers as they navigated the complexities of their unusual situation. Their dynamic was further complicated by Teddy's simultaneous romantic relationship with Andrew Perkins, creating a triangle where Henry had to watch the woman he married to date other men, while he fell increasingly in love with her. Henry's medical condition required constant vigilance and regular procedures, including the removal of tumors, management of his diabetes, and participation in experimental trials designed to improve his quality of life. His enrollment in Richard Weber's diabetes trial represented his attempt to gain independence and prove to Teddy that he could be more than just a patient in need of care. The final crisis, when Henry started experiencing concerning symptoms, including coughing up blood, which indicated that his condition was worsening despite all medical interventions. When Teddy brought him to the emergency room, scans revealed a tumor near his heart that was causing bleeding in his lungs and trachea, creating a life-threatening situation that required immediate surgical intervention. The cruel irony of Henry's final surgery was that Teddy, as his wife and the person who loved him most, was prohibited from operating on him due to their personal relationship. Instead, Christina Yang was assigned to perform the procedure, but she was deliberately not told the patient's identity to maintain her objectivity and prevent emotional compromise during the surgery. Christina initially planned to remove the tumor using a bronchoscope and laser, but excessive bleeding forced Richard Weber to step in and convert to open chest surgery. When they opened Henry's chest, they discovered that the tumor had eroded his pulmonary artery, causing catastrophic bleeding that overwhelmed his cardiovascular system. Despite the surgical team's extraordinary efforts, Henry's heart could not tolerate the massive blood loss. He was pronounced dead. The timing of Henry's death was particularly cruel because it occurred just as he and Teddy had finally acknowledged their feelings for each other and begun building a real marriage. His death robbed them of the future they had just begun to envision together. And then came the crash, a literal plane crash. With it, it took. Lexi Gray's death in the season 8 finale represented one of Grey's Anatomy's most heartbreaking losses, destroying a character who had overcome incredible odds to find her place in the world, and proving that tragedy can strike just when life seems to be falling into place. Kyler Leigh's portrayal of Meredith's enthusiastic half-sister had evolved from an annoying newcomer to a beloved member of the Seattle Grace family, making her death in the plane crash all the more devastating for viewers who had watched her grow from an insecure intern into a confident surgeon. Lexi had arrived at Seattle Grace Hospital carrying the burden of a complicated family history, desperate to connect with the half-sister she had fantasized about meeting her entire life. As the daughter of Thatcher Gray and his second wife, Susan, Lexi grew up knowing about Meredith's existence, but never having the opportunity to build a relationship with her. When Susan died from complications following what should have been a routine hiccup treatment, Lexi lost her mother and watched her father spiral into alcoholism, leaving her to care for him while managing her own grief and pursuing her medical career. Despite Meredith's initial resistance and outright hostility, Lexi never gave up on her dream of having a sister. Her persistence in trying to connect with Meredith, combined with her photographic memory and genuine kindness, eventually broke down the walls that Meredith had built around her heart. By the time of the plane crash, they had developed a genuine sisterly bond that meant everything to both of them. The plane crash occurred during what should have been a routine medical transport to Boise, Idaho, where the Seattle Grace team was scheduled to assist with surgery to separate conjoined twins. The aircraft encountered severe weather conditions that caused catastrophic structural failure, with the back section breaking off and crashing in a remote wooded area, instantly transforming skilled surgeons into trauma victims fighting for survival in the wilderness. When the plane went down, Lexi found herself separated from most of the other survivors, trapped under a massive piece of aircraft debris that had crushed her pelvis and legs. The injuries were immediately life-threatening, with internal bleeding and possible damage to vital organs that would require immediate surgical intervention, impossible in their remote location. Despite her medical training, Lexi understood the severity of her situation and the grim reality that help was unlikely to arrive in time. The discovery of Lexi's location by Mark and Christina created one of the series' most emotionally devastating scenes. Using a bell to create noise by knocking it against the debris, Lexi had managed to signal her location to the other survivors. Mark's immediate attempt to lift the aircraft debris proved futile, as the weight was far beyond what any individual could manage. Christina went to gather medical supplies, leaving Mark and Lexi alone for their final conversation. Despite Mark's desperate attempts to remain optimistic, Lexi demonstrated remarkable courage and clarity in her final moments. Her request for Mark to tell Meredith that she had been a good sister showed her concern for others, even as her own life ebbed away. The exchange of love declarations between Mark and Lexi provided both heartbreak and closure to their complicated relationship. When Mark finally admitted that he loved her, Lexi's response that he didn't have to say it just because she was dying showed her understanding of the situation. But Mark's insistence that his feelings were genuine provided emotional resolution. Their shared fantasy about marriage and children painted a picture of the life they might have had together. Mark's final words to Lexi, that they were meant to be, became her last words as she repeated them with a smile before succumbing to her injuries, providing a bittersweet end to their love story. And somehow, it was about to get even worse. Drop a comment with the death that broke you the most. We'll be crying with you in the replies. Mark's journey to Seattle Grace Hospital had begun with betrayal and desperation, arriving in the aftermath of his affair with Addison Montgomery that had destroyed his lifelong friendship with Derek Shepard. The revelation that Mark had slept with Derek's wife in their own bedroom represented one of the most fundamental violations of trust possible between friends, turning brothers into enemies and forcing Derek to flee New York for Seattle. Mark's subsequent move to the West Coast was initially motivated by selfish desires to win back both Derek's friendship and Addison's love. What made Mark's character development so compelling was his gradual transformation from a man driven entirely by his own desires to someone capable of genuine love and sacrifice. His relationship with Lexi Gray became the catalyst for this change, forcing him to confront his commitment issues and emotional immaturity while learning to care about someone else's needs and feelings. The complexities of Mark's personal life were further complicated by his unexpected role as a father to both his teenage daughters, Sloane, and later to Sophia, his child with Kelly Torres. Mark was on the same plane as Lexi when it crashed. Unlike some of the other passengers, Mark initially appeared to have escaped serious injury, giving false hope that he might be one of the lucky survivors. The true extent of Mark's injuries became apparent only after Lexi's death, when the emotional trauma of losing the woman he loved caused his body to reveal the hidden damage from the crash. Christina's examination revealed that Mark was suffering from cardiac tamponade, a life-threatening condition where fluid accumulates around the heart, preventing it from beating effectively. This internal injury was invisible from the outside, but potentially fatal without immediate medical intervention. The makeshift treatment that Meredith and Christina provided using supplies salvaged from the plane wreckage temporarily stabilized Mark's condition, but it was clear that he needed comprehensive medical care, impossible to provide in the wilderness. Their ability to drain the fluid around his heart using improvised tools demonstrated both their medical skills and the desperate nature of their situation, buying time they hoped would allow rescue teams to find them. Mark's emotional state during their time in the woods was as critical as his physical condition. The loss of Lexi had devastated him completely, removing his primary motivation to fight for survival and leaving him questioning whether he wanted to continue living without her. His comment to Arizona that he would be okay because Lexi is waiting for me revealed his readiness to give up and join the woman he loved in death. The aftermath of the rescue initially seemed promising, with Mark surviving the transport to medical facilities and receiving comprehensive care. However, the full extent of the damage caused by the crash, combined with the psychological trauma of losing Lexi and enduring days of survival in the wilderness, proved too much for his body to overcome. Mark's brief period of consciousness after 2 months of decline proved a cruel moment of hope. But this lucidity proved to be a final gift rather than a sign of recovery. The decision to remove Mark from life support after 30 days in a coma honored his own wishes as expressed in his advance directives. Derek and Callie's presence during Mark's final moments provided the emotional support he deserved after years of building genuine friendships and family bonds at Seattle Grace Hospital. I think Mark's death was particularly devastating because it represented the loss of someone who had genuinely changed for the better, proving that redemption and growth don't guarantee survival. The fact that he died just as he had found peace with himself and his relationships made the loss even more unfair. From lovers to fathers, Grey's Anatomy doesn't care. Babies were next. Samuel Norbert Avery's death represented one of Grey's Anatomy's most heartbreaking losses, proving that sometimes the most devastating tragedies involve the smallest victims who never get the chance to live. The death of Jackson Avery and April Kepner's son during season 11 created one of the series' most emotionally devastating episodes, demonstrating how the loss of a child can destroy even the strongest relationships while forcing parents to make impossible decisions about love, pain, and letting go. The tragedy began during what should have been a routine prenatal appointment when April's ultrasound revealed abnormalities in their unborn baby's bone development. Additional testing led to the devastating diagnosis of type 2 osteogenesis imperfecta, the most severe form of brittle bone disease. Unlike milder forms that allow children to live relatively normal lives, type 2 is typically fatal, causing bones to break repeatedly and spontaneously even before birth. The medical team explained that their baby was experiencing pain from constantly breaking bones while still developing in utero. The decision-making process that Jackson and April faced represented one of the most emotionally complex situations ever portrayed on Grey's Anatomy. They were forced to choose between continuing the pregnancy and hoping for a miracle versus ending their baby's suffering by inducing early labor at 24 weeks. The medical facts were clear. Type 2 osteogenesis imperfecta is incompatible with long-term survival, and babies born with this condition typically live only minutes or hours after birth. Dr. Nicole Herman's compassionate approach provided Jackson and April with the medical support they needed while respecting their autonomy as parents. Their choice to induce labor rather than continue the pregnancy demonstrated their prioritization of ending Samuel's suffering over extending their time with him. Samuel's birth was marked by profound sadness, combined with the precious opportunity for his parents to meet and hold their son. The decision to have him baptized immediately after birth reflected April's deep religious faith. The time Jackson and April spent holding Samuel represented both the fulfillment of their dreams of parenthood and the simultaneous destruction of those dreams, as they experienced the joy of meeting their son while knowing they were also saying goodbye. Samuel's peaceful death while being held by his parents offered comfort in an otherwise tragic situation. The aftermath created profound effects on both Jackson and April, with April's crisis of faith and Jackson's emotional withdrawal creating distance between them when they most needed each other's support. I think Samuel's death was one of Grey's Anatomy's most effective tragedies because it dealt with a loss many viewers could relate to while treating the subject with the appropriate gravity and respect, never exploiting the tragedy for shock value. And when you thought it couldn't get any crueler, they killed McDreamy. Patrick Dempsey was McDreamy and had made Derek the heart of the series for 11 seasons, and his death would fundamentally alter the show's DNA while breaking the hearts of millions of viewers who had invested in his epic romance with Meredith Grey. The circumstances leading to Derek's fatal accident began with his decision to leave his prestigious position with the President's Brain Mapping Initiative in Washington, D.C., to return permanently to Seattle and his family. After months of commuting between coasts and growing tension in his marriage to Meredith, Derek realized that no professional opportunity was worth sacrificing his relationship with his wife and children. On what would become his final day, Derek was driving to the airport for one last trip to D.C. to formally resign from his position when he witnessed a catastrophic multi-car accident on a remote stretch of highway. Without hesitation, Derek's medical instincts took over, and he immediately stopped to provide aid to the crash victims. His quick thinking and surgical skills saved 4 people from the wreckage before emergency responders arrived. This selfless act of heroism would ironically set in motion the events that would cost him his own life. After ensuring that the crash victims were in the hands of emergency personnel, Derek returned to his car and began turning around to continue his journey to the airport. The fatal mistake occurred when his phone rang, causing him to reach for it, while his car was positioned sideways across the road. In that moment of distraction, Derek failed to notice an approaching 18-wheeler truck that crashed into the driver's side of his car with devastating force, causing injuries that would prove fatal despite his status as one of the world's most skilled neurosurgeons. Derek was transported to Dillard Medical Center, a small hospital that lacked the specialized resources and expertise available at major medical centers. Despite being conscious and aware of his condition, Derek was unable to communicate verbally due to his injuries, creating a nightmarish situation where he could mentally assess his own medical needs, but couldn't convey this crucial information to his treating physicians. His internal monologue during this period provided viewers with a unique and heartbreaking perspective as he watched his own medical care unfold. The medical errors that led to Derek's death created one of the most frustrating and tragic scenarios in television history. Derek knew immediately that he needed a head CT scan to assess potential brain trauma, but the attending physician, Dr. Paul Costello, dismissed the concerns of resident Dr. Penelope Blake, who recognized the urgency of obtaining brain imaging. Instead, Costello focused on Derek's abdominal bleeding, which was stable enough to allow time for the more critical neurological assessment that Derek desperately needed. The delay in obtaining proper neurological evaluation proved fatal as Derek's brain injury worsened with each passing minute. By the time the medical team finally realized they needed a neurosurgeon and managed to get one to the hospital, a process that took over an hour, Derek's brain had swollen beyond the point where surgical intervention could save him. The cruel irony that one of the world's most talented neurosurgeons died from a treatable brain injury due to medical negligence was not lost on viewers. Derek's internal narration during his final hours provided unprecedented insight into the experience of being a critically injured patient who understands their condition but cannot communicate with their caregivers. His mental pleas for proper medical care, combined with his growing realization that he was dying, created an emotionally devastating viewing experience. The decision to have Meredith travel to Dillard Medical Center to say goodbye to Derek created one of the series' most emotionally powerful scenes. When she arrived and saw the extent of his injuries, she was faced with the impossible decision of whether to maintain hope for recovery or accept the medical reality that Derek was brain dead. Her choice to remove him from life support represented both an act of love and an acknowledgement that Derek would not want to exist in a vegetative state. Meredith's final moments with Derek, where she told him, "You can go," while holding his chest as he took his last breath, provided closure to their epic love story, while also beginning her journey as a widow and single mother. I think Derek's death was the most impactful in Grey's Anatomy history because it destroyed the show's foundational relationship while demonstrating that medical knowledge and skill can't always prevent tragedy. His death from preventable medical errors was particularly cruel, showing that even the most talented doctors are vulnerable when they become patients themselves. And if you somehow survived that emotional wreckage, DeLuca's ending made sure you wouldn't leave with dry eyes. Andrew DeLuca's death represented one of Grey's Anatomy's most tragic losses, proving that sometimes heroes die, not from accidents or illness, but from their unwavering commitment to protecting the most vulnerable members of society. Giacomo Gianniotti's portrayal of the passionate Italian surgeon had made Andrew a beloved character who struggles with mental health and dedication to justice, created a complex figure whose death would devastate both his colleagues and viewers who had watched him fight his demons. Andrew's journey toward his fatal encounter began with his deteriorating mental health throughout season 16, as he displayed increasingly manic behavior that mirrored his father Vicencio's bipolar disorder. His colleagues watched with growing concern as Andrew's actions became more erratic and impulsive, from his obsessive pursuit of difficult diagnoses to his reckless behavior during a blizzard to retrieve a liver for transplant. The crisis that would ultimately lead to Andrew's death began when he encountered a teenage patient in the clinic who came in with her supposed aunt, Opal. Andrew's medical training and intuitive understanding of human behavior led him to suspect that the relationship between the girl and the older woman wasn't what it appeared to be. His growing conviction that the patient was a victim of human trafficking and that Opal was her trafficker put him in direct conflict with with his colleagues, who viewed his concerns through the lens of his recent mental health struggles. Andrew's attempts to convince his superiors of the danger the young patient faced were met with skepticism and concern for his psychological state, rather than serious consideration of his suspicions. Dr. Bailey, in particular, dismissed his concerns as paranoid delusions brought on by his manic episode, despite Andrew's passionate pleas for someone to listen to him. This institutional failure to take his concerns seriously represented a devastating commentary on how mental health stigma can prevent people from being heard, even when they're trying to save lives. The confrontation in the hospital waiting room became one of the most heartbreaking scenes in the series, as Andrew desperately tried to protect a patient by keeping her separated from Opal, while his colleagues formed a protective circle around him instead of the potential victim. His increasingly frantic attempts to explain the situation and call for security to detain Opal were interpreted as evidence of his deteriorating mental state, rather than the actions of someone trying to prevent a serious crime. The aftermath of this incident was devastating for Andrew, who quit his job rather than accept the suspension Bailey offered him, knowing he had failed to protect someone he believed was in danger, combined with the fact that no one had believed him, sent Andrew into a deep depression that lasted for months. His vindication came too late when the patient, whose real name was Aaron Banks, returned to the hospital in worse condition and confirmed that Andrew had been right about the trafficking situation all along. Andrew's decision to pursue Opal when she returned to the hospital during the COVID-19 pandemic represented both his commitment to justice and his determination to finish what he had started. Despite being on medical leave and struggling with his mental health, Andrew recognized Opal in the hospital parking lot and enlisted his sister Karina's help in following her to prevent more victims from being harmed. His choice to pursue a dangerous criminal without backup demonstrated both his courage and his tragic inability to prioritize his own safety over his mission to protect others. The stabbing itself occurred as Andrew and Karina were trailing Opal through Seattle, with Andrew being attacked by an unknown assailant who was working with the trafficking ring. The brutal assault left Andrew with life-threatening injuries that required immediate surgery, but it also represented the ultimate price of his heroism. Andrew's initial surgery appeared successful, giving hope that he might survive his injuries and continue his fight against human trafficking. However, his condition deteriorated when he developed a cardiac tamponade, fluid accumulating around the heart and preventing it from beating effectively. Despite the surgical team's best efforts to save him, Andrew's injuries proved too severe for even their considerable skills to overcome. The supernatural element of Andrew's death, portrayed through Meredith's COVID-induced beach dreams, provided both comfort and heartbreak as viewers watched him reunite with his deceased mother while saying goodbye to the woman he loved. His statement that he didn't regret following Opal perfectly encapsulated his character's moral compass. I think Andrew's death was particularly powerful because it combined heroism with tragedy, showing how someone's greatest strength, their willingness to fight for others, can also become their fatal weakness. His story served as both an inspiration and a warning about the costs of standing up for what's right in a world that doesn't always want to listen. Grey's Anatomy carved out pieces of the viewers' hearts, one episode at a time, whether it was a crush, a mentor, or someone who only had minutes of screen time. These deaths left scars that never fully healed, and somehow we kept watching because no one breaks your heart like Shonda Rhimes.